Welcome, everybody, to the Coach's Corner. I'm Mike Cassidy, and this week, again, joining us is another one of our great NetSetCareers.com coach is Melissa McDonough. How are you doing, Melissa?
I'm doing great. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing really well. So this week, I wanted to try something a little different. In the ways that I've been thinking about trying to identify or find and be able to secure your job, dream job in intelligence or security, and always thinking about new ways we can help, explain or help our clients to go through that process, which can be often confusing, muddled, somewhat intentionally, somewhat unintentionally, but nevertheless, figure out a different way to help them get through that process and basically take a little more control over that process. And I know we've had this conversation a couple of times, and one of the things that I think that I've always said generally is that in order to get the job, you got to do the job a little bit. And in one way to think about that is can you use some of the, publicly available intelligence tools or frameworks to help you go through that process. And one of those key ones that we use, particularly within the intelligence community, is something called the intelligence cycle. Which is something that is near and dear to all analysts' heart, and people know it, but ultimately can be helpful in this context. So, knowing you are as a expert analyst yourself, I was wondering if you could help us walk through what the intelligence cycle is, and then from there, we can start talking a little bit about how it might apply to job seekers.
Sure. So the Intel cycle, I would say the Intel cycle is the cycle that's used to help us identify different parts of our information collection and planning procedures that ultimately gets the decision makers the best information they can possible. And it also helps kind of form a strategy for how to identify that information. And also just what information is needed, which is a huge part of it, as we'll go over. So the first part is planning and direction. So that's really the part where you identify the customer requirements, you outline the information gaps and needs, and develop a strategy. And that's really critical to any kind of success of an Intel program. And then the second step is collection. Collection is the part that helps us determine where and how to conduct our information acquisition, and where it also identifies how we want to gather that information. So the collection is just gathering all the info. You're kind of collecting everything. And that goes into the next step, which is processing and exploitation. So you're getting all of that raw intelligence data, and you are starting to process what you have and also determine its usefulness. And then we've got the next step, which I think is step 4 at this point, analysis and production. And that's really what people think of when they think of intelligence analysis. They don't even think that we've done all of the planning, direction, collection, all the other steps. Analysis is kind of the bread and butter, and that's when you identify what you have, evaluate it, weigh evidence, establish and test your hypotheses, draft and revise arguments and products. And it's really the part where you start looking at some of the key components. So you're looking at the relevance of the information, the accuracy, the completeness, and satisfying the intelligence requirements. So once you've done all that fun stuff, you get into the actual point where you've probably written something and you want to disseminate it. And that is a dissemination and integration. And this is really where you are giving those products to your customer so that they can absorb the information. But I'd say that probably the most important part of the Intel cycle that is almost always forgotten is the last part, and that's evaluation and feedback, where you are getting all of the opinions and feedback from your customers, and you're making sure that your future part of the process is getting better with time. So don't forget that last one as well.
No, yeah, you can't forget that. So let's go back a little bit. Let's go to the first one in terms of planning and direction, at least in the Intel cycle, and my experience has been into it. I want to talk about one of the more important parts of this. This is probably getting a start on this is really key, because any intelligence analyst knows that when they're given some tasking from policymaker or warfighter, usually comes in the phrase, starts with the phrase, "Tell me everything about a situation." And one of those things is a key piece of that as job as intelligence professionals is to really look critically at that question, "Tell me everything about," because they really don't mean "tell me about everything about." They don't have the time to consume everything about that, and isn't necessary, may in the end confuse the situation. So I don't know if your experience has been, Melissa, but I can tell you that a key thing that I've been doing is in that part of that process is to ask myself, or even then, even dig into a little bit, is what is the essential thing that they are looking for under what they call requirements from that. So a key first step, at least in the Intel cycle, is really doing that upfront work. Is like, what is the core question you're answering?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely you almost have to be a mind reader, I think, a little bit. You not only need to know what they are asking, but what they actually need to know, which is sometimes very, very different. So I think the more you know your customer, the more success you'll have, but you don't always have that luxury. So sometimes you get these really off the wall questions. I know I do a lot in private sector intel, and the product will turn out to be completely different than what the initial question was.
Yeah, and going on the other side of that as well, as I'll say, is you talked about the importance of getting feedback. You'd like to think, at least in the Intel world, that feedback is something that you're given, a product is delivered to the customer, and they give you detailed notes on how this improved or how that was used. And in general, my experience, everything from doing something small, like a half a page type of, near-term hit product, to doing something for the PDB, the most I would really get sometimes would be, "Oh, that was read with interest," which, okay. Or maybe you'll get some feedback here or there from that. So a lot of one of those ways is, if you ask the customer in some ways what they what their feedback is, you may be disappointed. But there are other ways, and looking for clues as to how did that land with them, how can they use that, and so that's also important to see if there's a way to gather feedback from unique and creative ways.
Yeah, we do a lot of surveys, but the chances of somebody actually filling out those surveys is very, very low. So, yeah, I completely echo your sentiment on that.
Yeah, you can't give a $10 Amazon gift card. So in the
Well,
intelligence,
we can, but
well,
yeah.
in your world, not in everybody's world. So one of the things is, so if that's the basis of it, you think about as what's helpful here is with this tool isn't necessarily that that this is something where it's imprinted or tattooed on you, but more as a fact of, at least it gives you a sense on where you are in a cycle or a process. Also know is, if you think about it in terms of evaluating from a career standpoint, also to think about what your role is. So for in analysis and production, well, the analyst is involved with all of these aspects of it, but I think in many cases, in their core element of it, there where the key is, where they're the main effort in military parlance, is really on the analysis and production side. So ultimately, they're their intermediate customer that gets to the end user. But you also think, but in the collection phase, the collector is the key. Hey, is it a SIGINT or HUMINTER or imagery analyst that is the one that is driving that, or natural technical means or something of that effect, to be able to gather the information that's needed. That's a key piece of that. So if that's something that you'd like to be and do that for your own, that's a key part of it. But also, and then they're up front, even planning and direction, collection managers, intelligence planners, other roles within it are also a key piece of that. And so think about it as in terms of a cycle overall, but it's also thinking about various parts of a team that work together to end up delivering a final product that's useful to the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this cycle is so important to know for Intel professionals and non-Intel professionals, because I think if people actually get more strategy, and I think it's useful for any part of your life, but yeah, I think this could be applied to so many other things.
So with that in mind, one of the things I want to switch to is, how can you use this framework, the intelligence cycle, in informing your job search? And really, it starts with, again, 6 phases to the cycle, but how we talk about it, and you can think in ways that, as you step through this, understanding where you are in your job search process, And how do you, and ultimately, kind of thinking this as an intelligence problem as your application. So it starts really with planning and direction. One of the key things we do here in NatSec Careers is when we first meet with a client, we want to know what, not only whereas in the Intel world, you want to know what your customer requirements are. Your first and foremost is understanding what your professional objectives are. What do you want to accomplish? What impact do you want to have? How do you think that's going to work? Or where do you think you can have the best impact of that? So really working through first and foremost, what your role is, and then understanding where you think you might be able to apply that role. The second part of that is the other side, which also is analogous there too, is looking at, okay, if you've chosen to be an analyst at a 3-letter agency, what are their requirements? What do they state? What do you know about what they're looking for? What makes a great analyst? What makes a great collector, if that's your role? But understanding is, how do you work through and understand, okay, you have your objectives and you have their requirements, and then taking that and understanding where the gaps in both in terms of what you bring to the table, or the things that you need to be able to highlight, or if you have basic gaps in your own information about what that means, are there things that can go to the next phase in the sort of moving towards collection? I think Melissa, have you had in your conversations with students, is that something that is pretty widely known when people walk in as to where they are, or how do you help them through that process yourself?
Yeah, I think it's important for students and also for transitioning people as well. I think both kind of need to work on this part of the cycle a lot, because I think a lot of times students especially will have an idea of where they want to go, or they'll have a hyper specific idea of where they want to go. So it'll be something like, I want to work at the CIA, or I want to work at, NSA, or something very, very specific. But it surprises me sometimes that a lot of people don't always use information that's available to them. I think it's awesome that these government agencies, especially, or any employer, will tell you exactly what they want, which is working as an Intel analyst. We don't usually have that luxury in the Intel cycle. The first thing I think is looking at the job, like trying to find out what the job is, and maybe that can be even more holistic question of what kind of things do I want in a job, which I think people should ask a lot more, instead of necessarily saying, okay, well, it sounds really cool to work at the CIA or one of those kind of agencies, and then they just kind of run towards that. Sometimes it's nice to take a step back and say, okay, well, what do I actually want? Maybe I want travel. Maybe I want to have a work-life balance. Maybe I want to have a real sense of mission in my work. So I think that the planning direction can work for holistic career goals, but it can also look for identifying an employer and just saying, they're telling me exactly what they want, and where do I need to work on this? And that's something, especially for the students, that we try to help them with, and saying, okay, well, what are they looking for? What do you have? What can you work on in the next few months to make your application just that much stronger?
Yeah, and I would say is a lot of what this process is in terms of hiring, when they're not hiring you for a job necessarily, they're hiring you for a career, particularly in the government side, because they're going to invest in you. And so as a result of that, what they're mostly looking for is the right fit. And the whole part of that process is the whole rest of the process, the application part, is to reveal that information for them is, hey, are you the right fit for both the role and the organization you've chosen to apply to? So for as much work as you can do on the upfront side of it is understanding and having a greater command of what you're looking for and your set of fit, where you think your fit is, the easier that process goes the rest of this cycle. And that's been my experience working with hundreds of students over the years with this. Is you can probably tell up front, is this going to be an easier process or not, based on if they've done that work up front for themselves. So but nevertheless, it's something where, as coaches, that's our goal ultimately when we first go through this process, is to really get through and dig into, so that when we go through the next phase, which we get into collection, for at least for this purpose, is that you're gathering the right information that you need to help you through this process. You're not just gathering information for the sake of gathering information. You're gathering it for the purposeful means of applying it to your application, whether that's in your resume, cover letter, or your sample narrative statements. In terms of like, so moving on, looking at that, obviously collection, again, working to gather the right information, processing, exploitation. It's not so much as what you'd have in other places where you're trying to do other processing, where you're taking satellite imagery and making it useful in this case, but mostly just in getting to a point where you're going to get to the real heavy lifting. In this case is on the production side. That's where you're doing the drafting of those tailored and resumes, cover letters, all of those things to get ready for that in first push into the application cycle, or at least into on the websites if that's where you're delivering those. It's no accident, for instance, that the particularly like the CIA, you have a 72-hour window to have all that stuff prepared and set in. That is something where I always joke is like, yeah, the minute you log onto that site, you're being tested. You just don't know it. Well, this is kind of one of those things is they want to make sure that you've done that preparation and that you're serious and ready to go with it. So that has been looking at those are, have you gathered the right stuff and are fully prepared to enter that process on the outset of that. So Melissa, in terms of like when you've looked at resumes and cover letters for this, is what are the things that you're looking for in terms of when you do that first interview or that first resume scrub?
Yeah, so I think, one thing for Intel jobs in particular is can they write like an Intel professional? And that's a big part of that is bottom line up front. You really have to anticipate the needs of your audience. And that is a big part of our job is kind of being those mind readers to understand, what does my audience want to see? So if I see a resume that does not have the information I want to see pretty much up front and in gold or something like that, that's just flashing at you. Like I'm an Intel professional. I have, Farsi, I have computer hacking skills. I have all this stuff. Like, you have to basically provide your audience with a very curated version of your own branding. And I think that's something that, a lot of people get confused with. They think they have to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the person who's reading their resume. And I've seen, I think the record right now has been an 8-page resume so far with coaching. And that's really a problem, especially if you're looking for certain agencies like CIA in particular. They want things very succinct. They want things very bottom line up front. So I, even in my own hiring that I do for my job outside of coaching, I look to see how that resume is written and can they connect with their audience and can they really kind of make their application sparkle a little bit more than the other applicants.
Yeah, when I think of tailoring, I'm thinking also in terms of, so if I'm applying for an analytic job, generally in our experience has been you want your education up front. And then there. Whereas if you're applying for a more operational role or more different types of roles where experience really matters, you want to put that up front. That is the key piece of that. The other thing is I would say you want to talk about in the bullets, and particularly where it is, when they say experience, what they really mean is impact. They want to know how have you made that organization better for you having been there. So a lot of that is translated into not just what you did, but why did it matter? So if you said you worked at some place and you were doing these things, talk about the scale and scope, talk about how much, where was it delivered? Who were the customers you were delivering it to? And what did it lead to? Why did it matter? Those are the types of things that employers, particularly in this field, because they're used to delivering these important products to their customers, they want to know that you've had experience doing that. And the best way to show that, as Melissa said, is through the resume, is connecting through that, making compelling on that versus, when the average employer is spending between 45 seconds to a minute on a resume, you really got to connect very quickly. And then, so as a matter building that stuff up front and making sure that, it pops, that's a big part of this. So again, goes back to what the requirements are. You know what they're looking for. You deliver it in your resume and cover letters. And then on the final part of this, I would say in terms of dissemination and integration, yeah, there's the functional pieces to make sure that you hit send or make sure it doesn't get, the website doesn't get hung up. But the hardest part, I would say, and for our business, particularly on the application side, is you're really not going to often get the feedback and know exactly why if you don't get to that next stage. So a core part of what you have to do is be able to seek out that type of feedback from others. So people that you trust, whether it's a coach, whether it's a friend, it's a parent, someone who's got knowledgeable or someone that can give you honest feedback in terms of what your presentation is, but also, or other ways to do it and unique. So that may be other resources that may be out there as well. So those are things that, particularly like an interview process or something like that, going through mock interviews and getting that, the more you get to that, the more feedback you get will inform the next time you go through this cycle, which inevitably will be the next time you put an application in.
Yeah, and I
So
think
how,
part of that feedback has to be self-feedback too, because you're not always going to get that from an employer. So I think it's a really good idea to take a good cold hard look at all the applications that you're putting in, and it's great to keep like an Excel spreadsheet to kind of keep track of all of those as well, or have some method of tracking your applications. I think taking a self-reflective stance on that can be helpful. Looking to see, are you hearing back on the applications? Because if you aren't hearing back, if it's just going to some black hole, I mean, obviously the government's going to take a really long time to review them, especially with the current state of things. But if you're even applying to some private sector jobs and you're still not hearing back, there might be something kind of wrong there. And that might be a good time to say, okay, well, what can I do for my resume to make this stronger? Am I shotgunning this out to shotgunning the same resume out to every single employer? Am I really spending a lot of time on each application and making sure that each application is including keywords that are in the job posting? Am I really taking time to make sure that the cover letter shows, both my experience and also my interest in the job? So I think, yeah, it's great if you can get feedback. I find that that's kind of rare, at least even the government as well. A lot of recruiters they won't tell you why you didn't get the job, or just goes to some kind of black hole. So sometimes that feedback section kind of needs to be also a period of self-reflection.
Yeah, important. Sometimes no feedback is feedback.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, I think in terms of the other thing is, I mean, a lot of this process, again, just my personal observation, I've been doing this for a few years now, is a lot of this process at the meta level is really testing your self-awareness, and understanding that, are you in that state of maturity or in a place where you're constantly seeking out that feedback? Are you constantly looking to enhance your performance so that you can get better the next time? So using each of these iterations that you go through, not as just a pro forma piece that is getting ready to reveal your excellence, but as a measure and a mechanism for you to genuinely try to connect and then figure out, hey, how can I improve myself as a job applicant? Then ultimately, when you're in the business and doing this Intel cycle for real, if that's what you want to do, are you enhancing your performance and delivering a better product for your customers, and then in some cases the nation? So that's kind of the way, if you think about it, is, again, in order to get the job, you got to do the job. So I want to thank you, Melissa, for taking the time. We can talk, working us through the Intel cycle. If you guys have a need and you want to be able to help, we're here to help you work through both this confusing process as a resource. Melissa is a fantastic coach that has been helping people. So please feel free to reach out. Go to natsetcareers.com and sign up for a consultation, and we'll be happy to help you see where you're at and help you get where you're going. Thanks again, Melissa, for today.
Thanks, Mike.